Let's do it. I'm here with César Hidalgo, Chile, from Chile, and professor, associate professor of media arts at MIT.
Yeah, I'm a professor here in the Media Lab, and I work by directing the collective learning group at MIT.
And How Information Grows is
my latest book.
Yes, your latest book. Studied, a physicist by training, an economist in a lot of ways. There's nothing about you that rings academic. He looks like he should be in a band, like the front man of a band, which is fantastic. And I love it. And we started this conversation. You were talking about information. What did he say? What was the first thing you said?
That when you create new content, you have some formats for legitimacy, like the papers, and other formats for diffusion, like the ones that you are more popular, whether you write a short form or you create a video.
Yeah, and diffusion is something that we've been talking about a lot in this podcast, right? So many ideas are stuck in books. It took the idea that vitamin C can cure scurvy. It took that idea to actually put it into practice, I think almost
150 years.
150 years. And for whatever reason, there's a lot of talk that goes on, but trying to get these ideas to look like something you can use is what's so crucial.
Yeah.
You know, we forget about how important persuasion is. So can you talk a little bit about that and how?
Yeah, we actually put a lot of work on trying to understand not only the diffusion of ideas, but the diffusion of knowledge, okay? Because I've done a lot of work trying to understand international development and why some countries, are doing better than others, and why some countries catch up very fast and other ones don't. And on the one hand, you have ideas, and ideas are very easy to diffuse from a communicational perspective. Mm-hmm. You can do a TED Talk, you can do like a movie that a lot of people see. And
metaphor, narrative.
Exactly. But knowledge, which is how to put an idea to action, that's really hard. So the idea of the computer is not foreign to you. The idea of how to build a computer with your own hands is very foreign to you.
It's very foreign to me, yeah.
That a second idea is knowledge. Includes knowledge and know-how. And actually what's funny about knowledge and know-how vis-a-vis ideas is that ideas are so small that you can talk about them, you can describe them, you can, say them in a sentence.
Yeah.
Knowledge is so big that it cannot even fit in a person. So the knowledge on how to build an airplane is larger than what a person can know. There's some people that need to know about metallurgy. There's other people that need to know about aerodynamics. There's other people that need to know about safety and regulations. And basically, you have to have a large company, because the knowledge that you need to do just that one product is so large that it doesn't fit on a person. So it's like if people would be USB drives, and we're all a little 1 gigabyte USB drive, and to make a plane you need a terabyte. Yeah. So you need a bunch of, and that's a lot of what I study, is why knowledge gets stuck, why it's hard to diffuse, how social networks contribute to the accumulation of knowledge, how do you measure the knowledge intensity of a place, and so forth.
Well, I do know that one way that bad ideas get disseminated is through narrative, through simple narratives. Narratives that sort of appeal to our base emotion, to our fears. So you can get a politician up there who can create a good guy and a bad guy.
Yeah.
And boy, is that effective. You can, you find the enemy, attack the enemy, and then paint yourself as the hero.
If it bleeds, it leads.
That's it, man.
Exactly.
That's it. So,
I completely agree, and as an academic, you always are suffering between those two words, because on the one hand, you know that you cannot make conclusions out of narratives, because narratives are what we would call anecdotes.
Right.
Okay? And you have to go from the world of anecdotes to the world of statistics, and to actually sometimes very complicated statistics to be able to have a claim on whether something causes something else in a certain set of narrow conditions, But after you do all of that, you cannot communicate those statistics back to people. So when you write a book, how do you write a book? Well, chapter 1 has to have a story that starts with a person that is doing an action to other people, and that kind of illustrates a point that then you hopefully are able to back up with the statistics,
right.
But you have to have kind of that personal narrative, because I think at the end of the day, human language is so much related to gossip. It's like to talk about other people.
Yes.
And subjects are people, verbs are actions that people
make. We were just literally talking about this.
Yeah.
So much of conversation is actually grooming. I think it was Dunbar,
Robin Dunbar,
who talks about that. It's a grooming mechanism. It's a way of just connection. It's not really about, because if you listen to the content of what people, my wife, a very smart woman, but she was talking to her friend, and it wasn't about a lot. I was like, holy shit! They were talking about open-toed shoes. I was like, I'm gonna. Does anybody have a gun I can stick in my mouth at this point? You know, some of it gets crazy, but they were doing so much more than just talk. It wasn't about that. They were connecting.
Yeah.
They were connecting. So, but how do you? I mean, as somebody who studies how information grows, right, and how it moves, if you could speak to the world, are there any ideas that you try to get out there? Are there any big ideas that you feel?
Yeah, well, I hope so.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So like there's a few, I think, like innovations or ideas that I think I've done, you know, that are contributions. Some of them are a little bit more, you know, intellectual. Some of them are very applied. So on the intellectual side, I think there's like a couple of contributions that I made, which is ways to measure the development of economies by having quantitative metrics of the knowledge that an economy has. So for instance, let's say you want to know how much knowledge is there in Germany vis-a-vis Thailand vis-a-vis Ghana.
Wow.
That sounds like a weird question, no?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. You know, and we know how much GDP each one of them has, you know, because since the 1930s, we kind of like have ways of starting to measure kind of like the output of the economy. But like GDP is not the same as knowledge, because you can get a lot of GDP from a single product like oil.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's products that are much more complex.
Yeah.
And they don't contribute that much to GDP, but like they are very knowledge intense and so forth. So like the way that we can do this is I created a formula that we published in 2009 that you can use to measure the knowledge intensity of a place by knowing what that place does. Okay? So just to put it in simple terms is imagine, you know, you want to know how much the chefs of the restaurants of your city know. But the only thing that you have is access to the menus. So you know what they know how to cook.
Right.
Okay? So there are going to be some chefs that they just have like chicken wings and fries on the menu, but everybody has chicken wings and fries on the children's part of the menu. So you can say, well, these chefs that only have that, probably they don't have too much knowledge.
Right.
They're doing something that is not very diverse, you know, they're doing a few products, and they're doing things that are very ubiquitous, that everybody else knows how to do. But there are other chefs that are going to be able to do that and more, and there are other chefs that are going to be able to do things that very few people know how to make.
Yeah.
So using the information of how many things you know how to make and how few people know how to make the same things, you can actually create a formula that tells you how much knowledge you estimate that group of people to have.
That's amazing. So it's like an algorithm or what?
Yeah, it's an eigenvector technically. You know,
It's a
like
what? It's a what?
Eigenvector.
I love talking to people like César Hidalgo, because I realize I'm a blue belt and I'm in front of a black belt. Yeah. It's the greatest thing. Of course, you know, but okay. And that's such a creative question. That's a creative question to ask, man.
Yeah, but it's nice because like at the end, you know, what's funny is that a lot of like the macroeconomic variables that we're used to look at, like growth and GDP and inequality, can be explained as a function of the knowledge intensity of economies. So when we find a country like China, if you look at it in 1985, according to GDP per capita was relatively poor, but if you look at the knowledge intensity of their economy based on the things that they were already exporting in 85, they were already way ahead of all of the other countries at the same level of income, and they were doomed to grow. Wow. You know? So you start kind of like seeing all of these development puzzles not as puzzles anymore, because you kind of like rotated the thing and you started to see the thing not from a perspective of commercial incentives or other theories, but from a perspective of knowledge accumulation and diffusion. And that helps you explain, you know, why some countries thrive, why some countries are more or less unequal, you know, and it opens like a new way of thinking about how we might make the world.
Would you say the United States is far and away the biggest knowledge economy?
I would say it's out there with other countries that are, you know, similar, I would say, in the knowledge intensity, because knowledge intensity at the same time, you know, is something that is per capita. So if I look at Silicon Valley and I look at Boston, you know, the knowledge intensity here is really large, in New York, in LA. Yeah. If you go to like rural Mississippi, the knowledge intensity there is not that large, you know. So if you look at the US as a whole and you take the averages, well, you know, if you take like rural Mississippi as a sample of the US, it's not going to compare to like, you know, Switzerland.
Sure.
Yeah. So in some way I would say, yes, the US is part of that knowledge frontier, but it's not alone in that knowledge frontier, and not all of the US is part of that knowledge frontier.
So you almost have to talk about the sort of microclimates, you've got to break it into smaller.
So you exactly, and you do this at all scales. So you look at the country scale, you look at the region scale, at the MSA, at the county. You can go like very, very deep.
I know Joseph Henrich, who wrote The Secret of Our Success, might answer why that is because when you have people that are close together of all different kinds of cultures and different backgrounds, they tend to share information, and that's how we get smarter.
Exactly. So we learn from differences. We don't learn from similarities. So like the problem of knowledge is that
we learn from differences, we don't learn from similarities.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the difficult thing of figuring out a measure for knowledge is that when we think of measuring things, we tend to think of the way in which we measure things, which is like, hey, water, you put more water in a cup, well, the cup has more water, Like you have something that is long and you make it longer, it becomes longer. So measures usually tend to be additive.
Yeah.
But knowledge is not additive, because let's say I know a lot about physics and you put me next to another guy that knows about physics. Well, together, like we don't have like that much knowledge diversity,
Yes.
But maybe you put me with someone that knows a lot about like computer science, this knowledge can be complementary and they can get enhanced. And maybe you put me with someone that knows about, I don't know, dance, that I don't know that much, and maybe there's a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge cannot be put to work together.
We have a term for this, it's called idea sex.
Okay.
I mean, it's sexy, but it's true. It's like that idea of like kind of putting all these ideas together. This side sees the world one way, you see the idea, and the ideas aren't really working. We need more of that in this country.
Yeah,
well, and in the world. And I think part of what's interesting is that what you're doing is you're upending some of the most basic assumptions about economics. Because usually the idea is a country should specialize if it wants to get wealthy and to get rich. And when you start to look at knowledge diversity, you start to realize, oh, actually, you need a diverse ecosystem of ideas, and that's really where wealth is generated from.
Exactly, and the nice thing is also like it helps you think about like how this works at different scales. So, for instance, as an individual, being a jack of all trades is probably kind of like a bad strategy, because you're going to be mediocre at all of them, and there's going to be people that is going to beat you. So you want to specialize a little bit and maybe quite a bit, but as a company also, you don't want to be a company that does completely everything. If you think about it, like one of the most paradoxical things I think of the companies of the last 20 years is that Google being so good at search sucks at social, and Facebook being so good at social sucks at search, and they're like even neighbors, and the niches sometimes are very small when you're at that scale. So diversity for economies is very valuable at the more ecosystem level, Silicon Valley has a lot of diversity of knowledge, but each one of the companies within Silicon Valley is much more narrow on their scope, and each of the teams within the company is much more narrow. So when we think about diversity and specialization, the question is, well, at what scale are we looking at? And at different scales, this diversity is useful, or in some of them,
Well, I would say that a lot of this is working in humanity's favor, because there is more of an equality of consumption. There is more available to all of us. Most people, even when they don't have a lot of money, have a cell phone, have an ability to search things, have an ability to entertain themselves, feed themselves, and stuff like that. But then there are problems like, for example, let's just take gun control as an example, or immigration, illegal immigration. Very emotional issues. Yeah. And people break into tribes. We all agree that we don't like spree shooters. We all agree that somebody who comes into a public space and starts shooting because they're mentally drained is a bad situation. Yeah. Then you get into the minutia of whether or not guns should be this available, and we can get into intelligent conversation. But my God, things shut right down. As somebody who's a little bit public, I have a podcast that it's very, very popular. This one, but also another one called The Fighter and the Kid, which is a very, 12 million downloads a month. I mean, it's crazy. Oh, wow. And what the point is, when my buddy, who was my partner, said, "Can we admit we have a gun problem?" That's all he said. And the amount of complaints. Apparently, my friend's not an American. Apparently, he should go back to Russia. I don't know what it was. You're a goat. I mean, he got called everything. How do you bridge that gap when you have two strong tribes and you know that you have a sick patient? I mean, it's like you have two teams of doctors. This team is saying, let's drug the patient. This team is saying, let's operate, but they're not talking to each other and the patient's dying. What's the answer there?
Yeah, and it's tough because, I've been in the US now for 15 years, and the shit did get worse in that dimension. I remember when was the Obama-McCain election, it was quite civil.
Yeah.
And especially in the last election cycle, things became increasingly more polar. I remember the day after Trump was elected, and people were walking on campus and ghosts, and it was kind of this weird feeling that people had. And I'm a little bit saddened by it, but at the same time, I think the way to think about it is these might be symptoms of deeper problems that you want to acknowledge as a country and as a nation, And I've started to think about some of those deeper problems as I talk with people and I try to understand, where they're coming from. So one of them, I think, there is a big crisis of social isolation. There is debated evidence on that. I was recently right here in my office like 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you know Sam Quiñones, who wrote this book Dreamland, which tells the whole story of the opioids epidemic. Oh, dude, it's fantastic. He published that book in 2015. Before that, people were not talking about it. Wow. Anything that you've seen in the New Yorker stuff like that basically rips off from this guy who wrote an amazing book.
What's his name?
Sam Quiñones.
Okay.
He's
Dreamland.
He's in LA because he's a reporter for LA Times. He used to be.
Let's get him on the podcast.
Yeah, you should get him. Yeah, oh, he's fantastic. And basically, what he's thinking and what he writes at the epilogue of the book is that, well, if you smoke pot, that's a social drug. If you drink, that's a social drug. But heroin is not a social drug. It's a drug of isolation or like basically being comfortable just by yourself. And I think what has happened to me, and this is going to be polemic, so maybe you're going to get a lot of people like shouting at this guy with an accent too.
Good, I hope so.
It's good for business.
It's just good. It's good to get people talking.
Yeah. So now we may be thinking that, hey, we have the gun violence problem, we have the opioids problem, we have the political polarization problem. Are these all independent problems, or could social isolation,
be the symptom,
be the cause,
of the symptoms,
and this be the symptoms? And there's good reason to believe. There is John Cacioppo, who died recently, who was a professor at Chicago, who studied loneliness. What are the symptoms of loneliness on a person? They're more irritable. They cannot see other people's point of view. Okay, they take things more personal, they get frustrated and so forth. Now, loneliness is not about knowing billions of people on Facebook. It's about those strong emotional connections, people that you can tell them that things are going bad, okay? And that is a number that has been diminishing according to some measures. Other people like doubt it, but like, Cacioppo and that group, they say that like a third of developed countries have that problem.
That makes total sense, because I really do think, I'm sorry, I don't want to hear, but so much of it is being able to rely on a network of people in case shit really goes bad. Like, for example, who do you know that you could actually borrow $20,000 from? You know what I mean? Or something crazy where it would really...
Or that you're going to stay a month
or stay in a month with. You're right, man. Those are
big
if you actually start, or hide a body.
Yeah. But it's also interesting. Well, Brian, we shouldn't talk about that on the podcast.
Sorry, I'm not credible.
No, but you were talking about like a third of developed countries, and I think that's part of the interesting thing for you as well. You grew up in Chile, right, where there is that strong sense of community, right, very often.
Yeah, more.
And I think what's always, the interesting, because I grew up in Brazil, is that the poorest people often have the strongest community.
Yeah.
And very often wealthy people don't really have community. And so the challenge is now to develop community. And I think part of why your work is so important is the fact that we look at differences of opinion differently. So differences of opinion are opportunity knocking for us all to evolve a solution that is better than what either of us started with.
Yeah. So like what I would say is now, why the heck are we so lonely? I have a pet theory, so don't put this as kind of like scientifically validated, but let's just throw a hypothesis out there. And the hypothesis is that in some way we have had a lot of growth happening in the world over the last 100 years. And part of that growth that has happened in the last century is because we figure out well how to work with strangers. We develop all of these market institutions. So today you don't need to have a friend for your clothes, or for your house, or for your transportation, or for your food, or for your entertainment, for your sex maybe even. If you have money, you can get all of that, So in some sense, we develop all of these institutions to deal with the market.
That you can pay for.
That you can pay for.
It's a transaction.
And that stuff makes it that in some way, those institutions, are based on way of interaction with clients. So if you are my client, I'm going to be very polite. I'm going to say yes. I'm not going to contradict you because I want to make the sale, don't I? Yeah. Now, am I ever going to become a friend of yours if I'm like that? No. So I'm going to stay always at that surface level. And I think that maybe what happened, and I see the clash here because I'm kind of like in this US East Coast liberal part that is supposed to be super accepting of diversity. I kind of like don't feel like it because I feel that there is an intimacy barrier that you cannot go down from.
Of course.
Because people are kind of like fucking stuck there on this eternal politeness and everybody afraid of what the other people were going to say.
Of trampling on somebody else's sensibilities.
Yeah. So like I come from an
So
environment
it's a
in which people
dishonest
joke.
interaction. It's
Yes, yeah.
it's dishonest. You can't joke. You can't fuck around. You can't because you don't know if you're going to be accused of sexual harassment. You don't know if you're going to be accused of being racist or homophobic or transphobic or whatever it might be. And so I think we're all shackled in that sense. We're all monitoring how we communicate, and that's not how human beings.
No, exactly. Feel comfortable. Yeah, we don't feel at home in that environment. So when we're in an environment that we are afraid of what other people is gonna say about us or judge us, and they're not gonna even tell us that, because I'm okay if I said something that is stupid and you tell me, oh, don't be an asshole. You know, I'm okay with that. But
You're
if
Chilean, though. You know, you're Chilean. I'm sorry. I'm telling you, man. The Latin culture, French culture. When you see how when you meet somebody and you kiss on both cheeks, okay. Look at dance, look at salsa, look at merengue, look at ramba. These are movements where you're speaking to each other. You can't have your own agenda, man. You have to react to what the person is giving you. There's something beautiful about. I always say that dance is nobody's dancing enough, man. It's very important. I swear to God, it would make the world a different place. But there is something like I notice a huge difference in cultures, right? So I perform all over the country, right? I'm here doing my show. You're welcome to come, by the way, but we're sold out. But I'll squeeze you in. but what's amazing is that when I go down to Miami and I perform, there's a huge Latin influx. It's Venezuelans, it's Chileans, it's Cubans. Man, it's a party. Man, there's no judgment. I get up there and they start laughing from minute 1 to minute 70. And it's, whoa, it's a party. When I go to Pittsburgh, all due respect, or I go to a place that's a little bit more reserved, there tends to be, the response is measured.
Okay.
They just don't let go as much. It's just a different way of dealing. There's more caution. There's more, it's almost like...
And when you come to Boston, how is it?
Boston is aggressive. It's great, but Boston's Irish. Boston is working class. Boston's been here a long time, so they're not giving much away. And if you're going to challenge certain assumptions, just be ready for a little pushback. There's a little bit like, first of all, I work for a living, so make me laugh. I don't want you to teach me. Let's be careful. Just be careful.
It's not a warm place. No. Yeah.
No, it's not. Boston's aggressive. Boston, you can get in a fight in Boston. You can go to a bar in Boston right now, and if you look at a guy for a little too long, you can get challenged.
Okay. But nothing in Cambridge is a bunch of like grad students from all over the world.
Very different.
Yeah, and
I'm
it's
talking about Boston.
Yeah,
I'm talking
like
about
Southie.
Yeah, I'm talking about when you go to. I'm telling you, and I've done these again. This is something I spend a lot of time when I go to bars in Boston. I'm telling you, the men, there is something. First of all, there's aggression.
You're talking like the bros that are dressed
the
like
bros.
with the Tom Brady shirt and with the baseball cap.
That's right.
And the tattoos.
That's
yeah,
right.
Exactly. Yeah.
That there is a. First of all, there's an aggression in the air, and fights are always going to break out. Now, here's the other thing I think is interesting. I don't have the science, but there is an extra layer on these men. There's an extra layer of muscle, bone, and fat. There is something about their ability to, it's armor. I am convinced that because the air of aggression is constant and omniscient everywhere, that their testosterone levels are higher than they would be, say, in Silicon Valley. And I'm not kidding. And that creates,
all the time.
yeah, man, and it creates, exactly, and it creates more muscle, more bone density. I'm telling you, man, there's just more of an extra layer. These guys are moving you around, and there's, you feel like you're in a forest of bears, and it's like a bunch of silverbacks, and I'm a baboon in the tree. So I always find myself having to find a corner, and I box. I was a wrestler. I understand the language a little bit, but in that.
So what do you think then about like the male culture in the U.S.? Because one of the things that to me is actually has been quite interesting is that even though the U.S. labels itself globally as progressive, the male culture here is extremely conservative. Guys cannot have feelings. They cannot cry. They like a recurrent topic of like storyline of a sitcom is the dad that didn't say I love you to their son in their entire life.
That's right. My father, I love my father, but my father was an Irish guy from Wisconsin. Emotion was a weakness. If you cried, you were a pussy. My father, I've never seen my father cry. I saw him cry when his mother died for a couple minutes, couple seconds. He went like this. He just went. That was it.
Yeah.
My mother saw him cry once in 40, 50 years of marriage. So that's very, very male. And I think,
but it's a very conservative type of point of view, because I think at the same time I do have like, if we're gonna be honest and like just talk candidly, I see a lot of like girls here that they get treated like crap by guys that never open up to them, and they have like shit relationships.
It's adversarial.
Yeah.
Because men and women are separated. So men and women, at least in this country, voluntarily almost separate about 6 years old. They start playing with each other, and then what happens is they basically break into these two tribes, and they come together in college. And then you're living with a woman for the first time, and you don't understand each other because there's a strange adversarial relationship between boys and girls in this country. You know, in Europe, when it's a bunch of girls and guys and they all just hang out. Yeah. There's a hangout, and and you get to know each other, and then you date, and then you break. But in the United States, because of the puritanical notion of sex, probably
like sex is taboo.
It's taboo, bro. Yeah. So what happens is I got to figure out a way to manipulate her into bed. So men and women are playing characters. The man is playing a hard. There's a lot of unoriginal macho and feminine energy. It's a meat mash, but it's adversarial. It's a fight. Yeah. You see
it sucks. Yeah, like I always dated foreigners here. Exactly.
It's true, man. And so there's something. American culture has certain pathologies, in my opinion. First of all, male-female dynamics, I think, again, you're talking about, they're both playing a character, so they're arriving in a dishonest state. Yeah. There's too much armor involved. Look at the way Americans eat. I travel so much. The amount of weight gain, the kinds of foods Americans eat, and food is very emotional, but it's not healthy for you. It's just not. No. And there's sort of a form of collective madness that I find a lot of times. And of course there are pockets where people do this, and there's a lot of innovation with food, and but I do think you're onto something. I think that there is. Why? I don't know. Do you have a theory on why?
Well, think about it's environment shapes behavior, right? Yeah. So what is the environment in which these people grew up in, right? So you can talk about different American subcultures, yes, right? But there is the experience of America as a whole that affects everybody, which is all about trying to be an individual, trying to stand out. You can't rely on the community for support. So it all becomes about,
you inventing your own way of doing things.
That's exactly right. And so everybody is trying to reinvent the wheels. And so firstly, that creates a certain stupidity because you're cut off from other information sources. You can't learn from the community because in a sense that is weakness, right? Needing other people's help. And then the other thing is that then part of it is because you have that loneliness, what is the relationship with food, right? The relationship with food is because there's that puritanical work ethic, so food is purely functional. It's about delivering nutrition as quickly and easily as possible. So that's why you have that fast food culture.
Exactly. It's not like a social meal in a Sunday in southern France.
Right.
Yeah.
And we don't take the time to prepare the food or select the food, right? It's also being clientized like you're talking about. So it's outsourced.
And now the healthy food is still kind of like sucks. It's kind of like cardboard healthy.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
You're right.
So there's all these dysfunctions within the culture that lead to this, and it all comes on out of these basic assumptions. But a lot of it is America's obsessed with productivity and only productivity and everything else and abundance and everything else is irrelevant.
On individual stuff like that. And I think like people in some way, they find weird ways of coping. So I find so many people here that live alone with dogs and they walk around with the dogs and you touch the dog and I feel like kind of like they have a dog as a way to get touched by someone else.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And it makes me kind of like sad,
My buddy had a bunch of puppies. His dog had a bunch of puppies. They went to the beach and they were renting the puppies out to girls. Yeah. It was like, who wants a puppy for an hour? And they made money. And the girls were like, I want it for an hour.
Well, so, and part of that is they've done studies on how much different cultures talk during an hour-long conversation. And, if you look, I think they did Cuban culture and French culture. And of course, it's just like they're touching each other nonstop during the conversation. The Americans in the whole hour-long conversation touch twice, and the English people touch 0 times.
Yeah. I would imagine Russia's probably not as warm either.
No, like you're surprised. Yeah, I married a Russian woman. I live with, yeah. So no, it's, it does have kind of like the roughness because I do think in Russia there is a like also strong separation between male and female culture. Mm-hmm. Similar to the US, I think part of that separation it's kind of like countries that have an identity associated with war, and the US has a very strong war-associated identity. Like the man is the guy that goes on to battle and comes back and then marries the woman that he promised.
It's part of our mythology.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like
think about all the movies that make money. It's one man who goes out and solves problems with violence.
But at the same time, like in the Russian culture, like I think there is a very strong role of the woman as like the convener of the family, and there is kind of like more of a matriarchy within the family than in the US. You know, in the US, I don't see you see that many examples of matriarchies, you know, that are, you know, within the family strong, and that basically is like the grandma, the one that is running the show.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
like, but I would say in Russia, like a lot of times it would be like, you know, there's a lot of grandmas around the show. In part also because in the 90s when everything went to shit, and you know, and there is a whole story if you ever want to do it about how, you know, Harvard had recommended people in Russia to privatize their businesses, and then the wives of the professor at Harvard were buying those shares of those businesses. Oh. And you can find all it on the internet.
Really?
Yeah, they closed a center there and everything. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of Russia's issue is the trauma of their recent past. I mean, World War I and World War II got rid of so many men. That was the other thing. And
no, but it was the 90s. It's the 90s.
No, it was the 90s. But I think that male aggression was for the Russian woman, for the Russian family, for the Russian spirit, was so important to repel the Nazis and repel the invaders.
Yeah.
So male aggression became something
that was... But they see themselves as very victorious. So just like the US tell itself all of these stories of like Pearl Harbor and everything, within the Russian language, they have Victory Day, you know, for World War II and all that stuff. But the 90s is different, because the 90s is, imagine, you had a whole generation of guys between, let's say, 35 and 45, that from one day to the next, the probability they would get a job in the future dropped to zero. Yeah. And they all became alcoholic, and they all died at 55. And there was a whole generation of widows that was generated, you know, during the 90s and the early 2000s, and it was so bad that kind of like generated, I think, like a really big stigma and pain, you know, in all of those families, that is much stronger than anything associated maybe with like the Soviet time or the previous wars.
The question is, what could have been done to avoid that? What information could have been diffused and moved into the brains of, you know, all these Russian men and maybe women and everything else to have avoided that?
Because there is kind of like also like one of the US does screw up a lot around the world. You know, that's kind of like has been a constant for a while. And you know, like this, the dissolution of the Soviet Union is one of those examples. And I think the reason why the US screws a lot around the world is because since things have worked, they don't understand why, and they have a very simplistic model. So the simplistic model is that, oh, like if things don't work, you kind of like change that president and things are going to work a little bit better and so forth. But in a lot of countries, it's not that easy, because countries are not run by people, are run by networks. So if you go to Iraq and you take away, you know, Saddam, what do you have? You have no one else.
Well, listen how we're talking about Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
He's the devil. Yes, okay, and he's the guy. If we can just get rid of Bashar al-Assad, who are you going to replace Bashar al-Assad with?
No, you go back to the Middle Ages, where the institutions have to be religious. So like, the fact that northern Iraq and eastern Syria are in a religious institution similar to the Middle Ages, because they look barbaric to now today, but Europe was like that, you know, in the Middle Ages too. Is because when you don't have like the modern institution, you collapse. Well, you know, that's the other layer of the cake that is left.
That's
you know?
right.
And so in the context of the Soviet Union, was kind of like this similar stupid idea that you could import these institutions. You kind of like Xeroxed a constitution, you Xerox some laws and everything. And well, if you are in an economy that had kind of like some centrally planned regime and so forth, there wasn't exporting anything out, oil and gas and everything. Well, if you open it up, which are the trade partners of these guys? They don't know anyone outside. They don't have any friends. So like developing commercial relationships is also something that is extremely path dependent. And we have studied that for a long time in the literature, and now we know it. But at that time, you know, the neo-capitalist elite, you know, a lot in this coast, had more kind of like of the idea is that if you have kind of like the right institutions and the market is free, like the computers figure everything out by itself as people through the price system discover the opportunities. And it's not. If a country has no commercial partners, because they never developed ththose relationships over a long period of time. You open it up, they have nobody to sell the shit. Everything is gonna go down the drain. And
it's exactly right. Some of these, it's like when I think it was South Africa. There was the notion that all companies have to be 25% owned by black people, by the black population. The problem was that those companies had taken hundreds of years to develop, and the people that were running those companies happened to have known nuts and bolts from the start to the big, how the entire system worked. So you can't just put somebody in at the top of that company who doesn't have an intimate knowledge of how that works, because then it's just not good for the company. So you can't just say, well, this is a particular color, let's put them at the helm. Whoever that was talking about that.
Yeah, we were the guys from the Renegade Report who were talking about that. But it's also, I mean, in terms of Russia, in terms of knowledge as well, these people had no knowledge of capitalism. So what happened is that they, for example, did voucher privatization, where they gave every Russian a voucher in the companies they were working for. Meanwhile, the people in Russia are starving. They don't really understand the idea of a share, so they sell them for nothing. And then what happens is all of the oligarchs go and scoop up all those vouchers overnight, and suddenly find that they've bought these companies for. But
I don't think it's a lack of understanding. It's not that these people were stupid and they didn't understand the concept of money, because honestly, the idea of capitalism and money is not that America invented in the 1940s. You know, like people have been having money since Mesopotamia, and at that time it wasn't built. But the thing is that at the same time you had like no choice. So if the only thing that you have is that voucher, and you have no money to buy anything for your family, you're gonna sell the only thing that you have, and you know, it's the voucher, and you sell the shoes then. You know. So I don't think it was kind of like a lack of understanding. Like people did understand how like a system with money and thing work, because they had that before. You know, and it was not alien to them. You know, but it was a system that was isolated. You know, and it has had also over all of the Western world still, you know, like a constant campaign of making them look like shit. They're the bad guys on the movies. They're the guys that politically they're against us, you know. So also, like as a national brand, who wants to, you know, buy the stuff from Russia? Who wants to like get their technology? It's the language was not there. There is a big language barrier, you know. So like there is kind of like a bit of a big problem of developing, you know, an economy in an international context. And in the case of China and Korea, they work very differently, because, you know, they did do it much more gradually, and they did it much more at the margin, and they did control themselves, you know, the ability to remove, you know, those barriers, and to do it in a context of like export oriented economies. In the case of Korea, they have like big links of the US, and the main export destination of Korea for a long time, you know, was the United States. So there is kind of like that. In the case of Russia, you open what's the main destination? Well, China comes, you know, pick up the plants, they buy them by parts, you know, and they smell the metal. You know?
Well, so for you, as an economist, as a physicist, as somebody who studies these patterns, we are headed for, you know, automation. Is going to change everything. Artificial intelligence is going to change everything already is. And probably large sections of our population will be left out of the job market, maybe. Hopefully not. We're at full employment now. What do you think of that? How do we prepare for that?
So I think a lot about that. I do think that there's certain drivers of jobs that are never going to go away, because they're built on our human necessity to feel useful or feel contributing back to a community. So in some way, you know, a lot of people like work on cultural activities nowadays, whether it's making movies, writing papers or books or stuff like that. And a lot of people offer to work with those people because they like their ideas, they like this type of thing that they do, and so forth. You know, so you do have a world in which work is not that much about getting that money. It's about, you know, reputation. It's about kind of like contributing to society. It's about like getting the respect. It's about like getting your idea out. It's about like influencing others. So and that part of the labor market, I think, has been increasing. But of course, you know, what we have is still at the margin of that, you know, like maybe 70 or 80% of the population that are still, you know, like doing change at a register or driving a truck or doing jobs that I would say many of them hate, you know.
Yeah, and they're going to be automated.
Yeah, and that are relatively easy to automate. So I do think that we're going to have a change, you know, of the social contract.
But that's a good question, though, because if you are somebody who is from rural Mississippi, or if you're somebody who is a truck driver, and that's your skill set, and you're a cashier or whatever it might be, what happens?
So look, I don't think I have a solution that will work from one day to the next, but I do think I have some ideas of how a more favorable end state might look like.
Okay.
Okay.
And who should implement those? The state? How do we do this?
Like I just gave a TED talk on how to use AI to improve the way that we implement democracy, to have a full continuum spectrum from what we have now to something extremely similar to what we have now, like all the way to have a world in which AI helps people make every decision, you know? And like basically there is a whole design space of that. So like putting that aside, you know, because I think that's
the TED talk.
Yeah, and that's a completely like longer conversation because there's a lot of nuances. It's an idea that is new, so you have to explain a lot of details. But on the other hand, like there is this guy called Hayek that you might have heard of. You know, he was an Austrian economist. And one of the things, you know, that he talked about is that, you know, markets work because they reveal information about what things people need to produce or not and stuff like that. So there has this famous paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society. You know, actually my book was a finalist of the Hayek Prize, you know, for books.
Wow.
And, well, what Hayek tells you in some way is that every time we consume, you know, we're producing value like in two forms. One thing is that, okay, you know, you have something that you value less than me and I give you money and you give it back to me, and therefore there was a transaction that, you know, was economically efficient. That would be like a neoclassical description of that. On the other hand, you know, by me buying something from you, whether it is buying something physically or listening to your podcast, I'm voting on your idea, you know, being interesting, and I'm paying you with a unit of attention, and the unit of attention is valuable because if you do something and nobody pays attention to it, and you try and you try and try and nobody pays attention to it, you might switch to do something else, or you might switch to work with someone that is doing stuff that people actually does want to watch, you know? So you can think that there is kind of like that value that we don't pay people now for. But let's say that now you have the cost of making things, and the cost of making things is going to go down with automation. And the value of attention is going to go up, you know? So at some point those lines might cross, and if those lines might cross, we might get a world in which the value that people provide through their attention, through their consumption, is large enough that it makes sense to subsidize them to consume. So think of a world that everybody makes movies, like this is a toy model, what you would say. You know, it's just a single product. Everybody makes movies. Some people are good at making movies, some people suck at making movies, but everybody watch movies. So everybody gets a subsidy and everybody has to buy movies to watch. Okay? But there's some guys that make great movies and a lot of people watch them, and those guys have huge teams and employ large numbers of people because a lot of money is flowing to them because they're making the movies that everyone wants to watch. Other people, you know, make movies that have little budgets and, you know, few people watch, some of them grow, some of them don't. Some people don't do shit, they just watch movies and enjoy time with their family, but their act of consumption, of helping figure out who are the guys that should be getting the money to make the movies.
Yeah. They're driving the economy in their own way because they're giving their unit of attention.
Exactly.
And you need people who are willing to give a unit of attention. They actually provide value as well.
Exactly.
So you're saying that spectators and participants are as important as the creators.
So like
they're driving the creators.
So I would say, of course, many people want to be creators and they want to get the message out, but I do think that you can have maybe an economy of spectators and creators, and that's such a weird
way of looking.
But
at it.
aren't we already there in some places?
Yeah, we are. We 100% are. Look at podcasts. Yeah. How many downloads? Yeah. My Instagram, what do I have? 370,000 followers. I can't even believe it. But I'll post a video sometimes. I get 150,000 views. Yeah. What? That's how many people are watching. I have no idea, but it's worth something. It's worth money. Yeah. Like I never even thought about that. You do a pie, you don't think you're going to, you know. But this is all. It's all part of how you start to measure. It's a metric. Yeah. It's a metric for.
So like last week I was at TED, you know, and TED is kind of like this conference that there's like the millionaires of the East Coast and the West Coast get together, and you know I go for free, so I'm the product. You know. So
it's true.
So, yeah. So anyway, and when you are in those places, I'm sure you've been in those places too, the amount of time that a person is alive kind of like to talk or to listen is very proportional to the amount of money that they have. So like the billionaires, you know, they say something, they take a pause, Then they can keep on talking. Someone is talking to a billionaire, they better articulate everything like really fast and really short because they're in a conveyor belt moving for the next one to come. You know, like one of the ways that the system that we have is so slow is that the billionaires have more money than time, you know? So they have more money than they have, you know, time to process and figure out how to spend it, you know? And that generates kind of like all of this also false positives because they have to use shortcuts, you know, to invest, you know, whether they are fads, whether there's social networks, whether there are stuff, you know, and still, you know, it's quite imperfect. And we live in a world, I think, where attention is by now one of the biggest, you know, resource constraints. And that's probably, you know, once you have something that everybody wants and there's not enough to go around, that's the economy.
So if we were to extrapolate that, does that look like, I mean, you were talking about subsidizing. Is that a universal income model to an extent? Is there?
I do like the UBI, but I'm a big fan.
Because Hayek is rolling in his grave right now.
Yeah. No, but I'm a big fan of evolution more than revolution. So, for example, the question of whether UBI is a good idea or a bad idea, it's a ill-posed question because the question is, well, from all of the billion possible designs that you could have for UBI and the billions of possible unrolling plans that you have, are there some choices in that design space that could work? You know,
that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. We don't know.
And we don't know, but I do think that
evolution versus revolution is such a great way to put it.
And the evolution thing would be, well, if there are some choices in that design space that work, probably it's not changing everything from one day to the next. So let's say we start like doing a UBI in which, hey, everybody that gets, you know, a PhD, you know, starts entering into the like UBI system at a low rate, you know, because there is people already in UBI. Retirees, you know, when you have a pension fund, that's a UBI. You know, like professor with tenure, you know, that's a UBI.
Yeah.
You know, so
right.
like in the military, kind of like some like a UBI. As long as you're willing to kind of like go to wherever they send you, you know, that's a UBI.
Safety, first responders, yeah.
So if you would like unroll that slowly, it's not kind of like, yes, there's going to be a UBI tomorrow and it's going to be $50,000 a year for everyone. But you start saying, no, there's people, and you have to kind of like get to a certain level that you show that.
It's kind of what a pension plan is, isn't it? I mean, in a way.
Yeah, I think, for example, what I would love is like a UBI strategy that would be like grad school for all. So you finish a good undergrad, you know, and then like basically the government would say something like, you know what, like people now need to work on creative jobs, you know, they need to, for that, learn how to integrate a team. So what we're going to do is we're going to give, you know, all of these 24, 25-year-olds like a 4-year voucher that you can go and trade in to be a grad student and do a PhD or grad school in any college that you want. And what you're going to be doing is not taking classes, because when you get to grad school, what you're doing is working on research, developing software, developing technologies, analyzing stuff, working on a team to do something creative. That's ultimately, like in academia, you cannot compete on size or scale or everything. The only thing that you can compete on is on creativity, you know? Yeah? Because you have like a huge overhead and you have a bunch of 24-year-olds. So that's it. You know? Yeah, exactly. So you have to compete on that. And in that context, you know, you might start having a system in which you can add people to this UBI economy gradually. And I think if you do it gradually and you keep always the system kind of like in equilibrium, you might be able to move it to here through there. Even though if those two solutions are stable, the way that you move it might be what determines whether you get there.
And I mean, that's what the Russia example really demonstrates, is that path dependence. Like, great, like you want Russia to be a fully functioning free market economy, but the way to do that is not to just privatize everything overnight and
evolution versus revolution.
Exactly, and they did the shock therapy, like they literally call it the shock therapy, like in the 90s. That's kind of like what they thought.
That's what Blythe talks about with austerity and all those.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you get these ideologies, you get these. And they're superimposed on what's already sort of a living organism, and it's very difficult.
Well, and it is a living organism, and this is also the difference between machine-based thinking about, you know, intellectual ecosystems and economies versus garden-based thinking, right? We know a garden has to be tended. You have to really see what it's already doing, how is it behaving, and then you have to have this very iterative, incremental, evolutionary approach to it. And the problem is that a lot of economic thinking is machine-based, right? Oh, we just create the institutions, we just create that, and then boom,
it goes back to
itself.
persuasion. It goes back to persuasion versus punishment in a lot of ways. I mean, you have to persuade people over to your side. You have to persuade people to behave a certain way because it's in their interest. When you again impose this idea that this is democracy. I know, hey, Iraq, you've been around for 5,000 years. I know you got a big historical footprint, but we've never been to Iraq. We don't know anything about Arab culture, but we're going to restructure your country.
Exactly, yeah.
What the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah,
It's also, I mean,
stupid.
This also goes back to American culture, individualistic. So how do Americans make sense of foreign policy? Oh, there's a bad guy. We have to remove the bad guy.
We do it all the time.
And then,
we never learn, though. I mean, this Syria thing it's hilarious to me. I was talking to a very smart guy who was talking about Bashar al-Assad, who's just like Hitler, and we're going to, what? Hold on. What are you going to put in his place?
Yeah.
We're going to do this again?
Yeah.
We started this mess because, anyway, I go crazy over that.
Well, or and sometimes we unlearn from our mistakes, right? One of the things that we did after we took out Hitler was we only denazified down some of the levels, because if you remove that whole bureaucracy, then the system falls apart. Whereas we de-Baathified all the way down, and then you remove all the institutional capacity.
And a lot of it was wrongful generalization. So after the Second World War, when the U.S. kind of gets this big high, we kind of eliminated, the Nazi regime, and also we did something similar in Japan. Those were two countries that before the Second World War, from an industrial capacity perspective, you can say whatever you want about the politics, but they were able to build good planes and good machines and everything, and they were countries that had a lot of productive knowledge. Mm-hmm. That shit is not the same if you go to Afghanistan. Yeah. So thinking that and what is funny is that a lot of the development thinking of the second half of the 20th century was based on that Marshall Plan, because basically the US, and the Allied powers flattened Germany, and then they say, no, we're going to put this money in Germany. Oh, and Germany started to grow fast and everything. It must be because of what we did. So then, actually, that's the rationale to create the World Bank and all these places, because they say, hey, if we do it for Germany,
it'll work for...
we'll do it for Africa and we'll make a profit on the interest. Honestly.
Totally different culture, totally different.
Exactly, and they thought that they were going to just lend money, and the countries were just going to grow magically, and then they're going to pay the money back, and of course that didn't work. So then, on the 70s and 80s, then they started saying, no, we have to develop technical assistance and reforming, So they asked countries, no, you have to change the rules to be our rules, because if you take the money but you don't change the rules, it's not going to work. And the countries that changed the rules, they didn't do any better, So there is a book from a colleague of mine, that actually look at all of the countries and whether they were star reformers or not star reformers when they were taking money from the World Bank, and the ones that were star reformers, they didn't do any fucking better, But at the same time, there is always this cultural imposition, and that's, I think, maybe the high horse that the US has to get off, because we're exporting a lot of culture. The US exports a lot of culture. Hollywood is huge. I say I grew up in Chile, but I grew up in the suburb of the US. I grew up watching Alf, MacGyver, and stuff like that. Zach Morris and Kelly Kapowski, all of that shit, So every show, so it's kind of weird, because you come here and people don't know shit about where you come from, and you know everything because you watch the same television and the same stuff and the lockers in.
That's right.
In college.
Well. Having said all this, I'm reminded of there's a Zen poet who wrote a book called One Continuous Mistake, and life is one continuous mistake. And it's true, and we're always adjusting, and I don't think we'll ever avoid that. But there's a book here that I'm looking at, Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. Yeah. And there are several books who were written by, he's a great thinker. And in that book, basically what he's saying is everything is getting better.
Yeah.
Everything is way better than you think, and we are making progress in almost all
dimensions.
All dimensions. We're getting a lot of things right, aren't we?
Yeah, so, and I agree with Steve. Steve is also a colleague, so I know him personally, but and I think he's right about everything that he puts in the book, and I think it's not just him, it's part of a movement. He just wrote this book. There is Max Roser at Oxford that has Our World in Data, has been pushing
Easterly,
all of that stuff.
What's his name?
Bill Easterly also, I would say, but also Dina Pomeranz at HBS. So there's a lot of people that are giving the news. I would say I have two caveats, one more than one is the loneliness part. So maybe everything is getting better, but people are getting lonely, getting more isolated, more individualistic. So we're getting better in terms of material well-being, in terms of reduction of violence, in terms of even environment maybe, but maybe, in the social isolation dimension, we have been going in the wrong direction, and there's evidence that is saying that the line is going on that direction. So I would agree with it. I do think that in general, the arc of history bends in a way that is positive, and the reason why it bends in a way that is positive is the way it's the same reason, because science works. And the thing is, when you do things that are good and are valuable and are positive and make sense and are empirically true and are valid, you can build on them. You cannot build on lies. So you can get ahead with lies for a short period of time. You can get ahead with anger and with other things for a short period of time. But over time, if you want to build a solid wall, you have to build on stuff that is solid. And science has shown that that's the case. So in some cases, science makes a lot of mistakes, but it starts self-correcting, and as it self-corrects, it becomes better, and as a consequence of that, our knowledge and technology and a lot of things, get to improve because we're building on these truths.
Yeah, but you said there were two caveats, so one is loneliness.
Yeah. The other one, would be, I think, and that is also some people that have shared that concern with me, the environmental part. So some people are not that sure. Maybe we're making a turn on the environmental part, but maybe over the last 50 years, actually our environment has not improved. He has a chapter, but he looks only, at a few measures. And some people say, if you look at all of the other measures, actually there's a lot of them that are, maybe more relevant, where the trend is the opposite. So that criticism is out there too.
Well, the other one as well is Will Easterly also wrote a book called The Tyranny of Experts. Yeah. And that's a large part of what we're talking about here is, shock therapy. You have some economists who have some ideology and then they just impose that rather than on having a really inclusive conversation where we understand that knowledge is local and that we're empowering the hive mind to figure out itself.
Hidalgo is not that guy.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is, specifically César's work really emphasizes the importance that it's about networks, not individuals. And so creating healthier networks and healthier information flows is really what we should be doing if we want more development and we want more prosperity.
Exactly. Imagine, like in the US, you guys elected Trump and the shit still works. Yeah. Because there must be a network underneath. Like imagine if Trump would have become president of Afghanistan or something. Like, what the fuck would have happened?
Yeah, exactly. You're right. You're 100% right.
And
you're right.
The one thing that I would love to talk just specifically about your book, Why Information Grows, and the importance of scale. Yeah. Because, firstly, the idea that information grows is not the standard narrative that we often hear, that the universe is just chaotic. Yeah. Right? So the universe, there is chaos, but there is this tendency towards order, and that we see that happening at every level of every scale. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that we're going to switch gears from social science to natural science. So as I told you before, I'm a physicist by background.
That's what César Hidalgo does. He switches. Two disciplines. One discipline's not enough for his brain.
Yeah. So like for a long time, people have been wondering why there's so much order in the universe. You look outside there, you see trees and you see like the flowers blooming, like they are not there. But anyway, and in the 19th century, Boltzmann wanted to explain the physical origins of order just like Darwin had explained the biological origins of order. So this idea of why there's structure, Darwin and Wallace had figured out that according to evolution through natural selection, you could get that structure, you could get that order. But then, as Boltzmann started to look at this idea, not from the perspective of living organisms, but like just inanimated matter, he found that he couldn't make it work. Actually, he was so frustrated that he kills himself. His daughter finds him, like in a hotel in Italy and so forth. So like he killed himself, but like what he had discovered is that the universe has kind of like this tendency of mixing itself in a way that it cannot get unmixed. So if I take, let's say some hot oil, and some vinegar, and I shake them together, the oil and the vinegar separates, but the temperatures mix in a way that can never separate again. So like that's kind of like the second law of thermodynamics. So you can have things that kind of like separate. Of course, more things that mix cannot get unmixed. But people would say, but what about oil and vinegar? Well, the temperatures of them are the ones that don't unmix. They become homogeneous and stuff like that. And Einstein worked on that problem then, and Gibbs, and there were a lot of statistical physicists working on that problem until this Russian guy, Ilya Prigozhin, in the 30s and 40s, figures out that the way to understand the origins of order is to think of systems that are out of equilibrium. So if you have a bathtub and you put hot water and cold water, at the end you have a bunch of lukewarm water. Yeah? And everything mixes, so in that sense, right. But now, if you remove the plunger of that bathtub, what happens is that the water starts racing down the drain. And as the water starts racing down the drain, that's not chaotic, because what happens is that the molecules of water start aligning with each other, to minimize the production of entropy, to minimize that friction, that dissipation, and in that, out of equilibrium system, you generate order. So what he figures out is that, okay, when you have a system in which there is a flow of energy, where you are expending energy, actually the system tries to conserve as much energy as possible, and to do that, it has to order itself, it has to organize.
So there's sort of an innate intelligence to even matter that's not organic.
Exactly, there is kind of like a fundamental physics law that tells you, hey, when things are going out of equilibrium, there are conditions under which they can order themselves. We are that. We are kind of like just like a bathtub whirlpool, but we're eating every day and we're pooping every day and we're getting energy through our body so that we can keep at that order.
Homeostasis.
Exactly, and we keep like that equilibrium order, but that equilibrium that we get is dynamic, we need the energy to keep it going, So like basically...
And I want to just stop you, because they've even said that in war, there is a point where a country, its civil war, will get to a point where it exhausts itself, where the violence just becomes so exhaustive that nobody fights anymore. That it just, that even in the worst civil wars, whether it's Afghanistan or wherever it might be, that there comes a point where there's a saturation point where the killing just stops because both sides are exhausted.
Yeah.
And order is restored, or something new is reborn.
Exactly. Well, I think you were talking about self-organization, like very simple system, but there's a few corollaries that I find that are interesting. One is that, like, basically, when you start thinking about the world in this statistical context, you answer the question why the arrow of time goes in one direction. Okay? And that's a very important question in physics, because if you look at the equation of motion in physics, they're time reversible. So if you have a pendulum and you take the equation for the pendulum and you change time for minus time, you reverse it, it's still true and it's still valid. If you throw a cannonball or you throw it back, that's still valid. So the mechanics of the universe are time reversible. But our experience is not. If a movie is playing backwards, it's clearly playing backwards. So why it's not? And Prigozhin basically figured that one out. And the reason why I figured that one out is that basically, like, what he realized is that, like, as a statistical system, the universe is moving in such a way that every possible present that we have has an infinite number of compatible pasts. Okay? So let's say this is just like, imagine that we use like the beans and balls type of analogy of atomic physics, So this is just a bunch of like ping pong balls bouncing off each other, So if you take a snapshot of all of the balls with all of their positions or their velocities, and then you want to say, hey, I want to see how these guys were 1 second ago, the number of different ways that they could have been 1 second ago starts growing exponentially and diverges. So it's an infinite number of times. So if you wanted to go backwards in time, there's an infinite possibility, but if you want to go forward in time, there's kind of like the possibilities are narrowing themselves down, So there's kind of like what we call the infinite entropy barrier if you go backwards, Wow. And what that tells you is that also, it's a very different concept of time, because we tend to think of time as kind of like something that happens outside of us.
Right.
So if we sit down and we don't do anything, or if we sit down and do something, an hour is an hour, But what like comes out from this idea is that there is no such a thing as time. The only thing that there is a present that is calculated at every instant. And there's no past and there's no future.
This is what freaking shit, man.
So there's a quantum physicist at Caltech named Spiros Michalakis that we've had on the podcast very often, and one of his big things is that, is that time is not a fundamental of the universe. It's an emergent property of much, much deeper things.
Yeah.
There's no time. There's only the present moment.
Yeah. And the next present is getting calculated every time from the present, and that's it. And so every time we remember something, we're imagining things, We're imagining the past, and that's kind of like cool, because then you go into psychology or like all of the gaps that we have when we imagine things. And,
yeah, man. Yeah.
I do think that I have to meet someone at 2:30, and I think we're past 2:30.
I was going to tell you that we've done a great job. Patreon, you guys have actually been giving money. That's something you set up. No idea. Never looked at the page. But I understand we're making enough money to break even. So I'm not losing money anymore. That's kind of good. After 300 episodes, I'm actually not losing money. We're actually breaking even. So give even more. It doesn't matter. Every little bit helps. $1,000, $6,000, even $10,000. And if you don't, well, you're cheap. Either way, we want to get rich, so give us money.
And
thanks.
make you more content.
Yes, well, we'll do it anyway.
Yeah, we really will.
We'll do it anyway, even if you don't give money. But give money, man, because we want to pay our engineers like Reed Nicewonder and other people who are dedicating their time. I'm amazed that so many people are willing to work for free, but I want to pay them. I'm not going to take any of the money. What am I going to do? Buy another Tesla? Anyway.